Our guest speaker tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is Mr. Eric Willmot AM, who comes from the Institute of Aboriginal Studies. He's going to talk to us, I hope, on Aboriginal family history. I haven't had much conversation with him. Would you give him a warm welcome, please?
Oh, great. Audible. Can you hear me now all right? I'm very sorry. I was about to say I'm very glad that to hear that you're so interested in the past and where you come from, because there is a very interesting statistic that links our two societies. I'm of Aboriginal descent, and the statistic is this, that if you take of the non-Aboriginal Australian population in Australia, any group of 100 people, the probability is well above 0.8 that one person in that group in their lifetime will find that they and their families are of some degree of Aboriginal descent. Nasty as it may seem either. Let me go on to tell you something about the society that one person in this group may find out, unfortunately or delightedly, that they're related to. Australia itself is a very interesting and unusual continent. It really is. In this, on Earth, in the long distant past, it was a world. Up till 1,000 years ago, about, it was an isolated world. So it was a real self-contained world, inasmuch as it was composed of nations, some 200 of them, separated linguistically. And these nations varied in size, as opposed to many thought that they were approximately the same size and only the land area is different. They did vary in size, and that's going to be important about what I'm going to tell you about tracing family histories. The country today, the country was never, ever heavily populated, and today it remains not essentially different on modern earthly standards to what it was prior to the British arrival in 1788. 70% of the continent still has a population level less than one person per 10 square kilometres, which makes our country absolutely unique on Earth today. And we've developed it more or less as modern Australians at least, have developed it more or less as a metropolitan archipelago. And that, I think, is the key to much of what you're searching and the way you look towards establishing family links, is that you are mostly descended from urban societies. The society that dwelt in Australia was not urban, and there are a number of societies like that throughout the world, elemental societies, which did not move towards urban development at all. In fact, go a step further, actually opposed that kind of development. And perhaps some other time you might invite me and I'll tell you why, or at least why I think this particular society here did that. Now, let me give you some idea of the nature of the society. It's a very ancient continental society and ranks in its importance in terms of human development with the other two continents of Europe and Africa. And no other continent matches that in length of human habitation. The society was divided into what I've described nations, or whatever you like to describe them. They were linguistically separate people. And so the language of somebody, an Aroa person who lived, for instance, in the Sydney Basin at the time of the arrival of the British, and that of, say, a Bardi person who lived in Western Australia would have been about as understandable as Russian and Scottish. And there was a language variation across the continent, but of course nearby groups would have some degree of mutual understanding between the languages, or at least the languages would be of a common style. The languages are curiously very Latin-like, and compared to any other languages on Earth, the language most like the oldest of the Australian languages, so-called Palmanungan languages, the only language which really is similar to them is Latin. They are classic suffixing languages and very structured sorts of languages with elaborate case structures and so forth. Now, the groups And I think it's best that I describe the place where we live close by, since it's an interesting spot. It always has been something of a meeting spot. And it will give you an idea. The rest of the country is more or less divided up like this. In any particular area of Australia you like to take, you would find there is some large dominating group, or numbers of large dominating groups, and then smaller groups, usually surrounding these. Now, for instance, where we are right now, there was a group known as the Ngunnawal people. And this is important to Aboriginal people because they don't simply want to know whether they're Aborigines or not. They usually know that. It's what kind of Aborigine they are. And that's exactly what interests you. You don't want to know whether you're European or not. It's usually what kind of European that's more interesting. Now, associated with the Ngunnawal group was another smaller group, a Walgaloo. But behind them lay a big, powerful group of people known as the Wiradjuri people. And between them and the Gamaluroi people from the north part of New South Wales, all of this state, part of Queensland and part of Victoria, was divided up essentially between those two groups. But right along the coast, there were a series of smaller groups. Now, the politics of those days tended to ascribe certain characteristics. Well, they certainly do, because in certain parts of the continent, still, you get the existence of large groups surrounded by smaller groups, such as the Northern Territory, where you have large groups such as Warlbri, Viginchara, and smaller groups such as Kaiditch and Luricha and so forth. And the politics of those two reflect very similar. The politics of modern Aboriginal society related to descent. So Aboriginal thinking in political terms, I don't think it's changed much in a few thousand years. And that's probably why it seems somewhat peculiar to most people who observe it from the outside. The particular group that lived in this particular part of the world here became, as far as we can say, entirely extinct, leaving no descendants whatsoever. And yet there was little actual conflict in this area between the incoming Europeans and the traditional group. The problem was mainly one of disease and very rapid lifestyle change. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite of conflict. There was Dan Cotter was in fact hidden out by a man called Honyon, who lived in this area for a number of years. He was being pursued by certain British authorities at the time. Now, so one of the problems are the groups that are extinct, which leave holes, if you like, within the existing framework. But the larger groups never, ever became extinct nor left descendants. Now that brings me to the next thing. Up until, in fact, the 1950s, it did appear as though fully descendant or traditional Australians were, in fact, going to become extinct. And their decline continued right through in numbers, right through to the 50s. But during that time, mixed-race people began to appear on the scene, and their numbers grew rapidly. So what you have today is a society of probably around about 200,000 people, census-wise about 180, of which 2/3 today are of mixed-race origin, and 1/3 is still, in a sense, fully descendant, but many of them aren't fully descendant, although not in the sense that they may be, there might be some mixed-race associations with other groups, such as the more ancient groups from Macassar and more recent groups from other parts of Southeast Asia. Now, and of course Afghan people and so forth who moved through those areas during that period. The problem with family histories is in fact identifying, as you probably are aware, the definition, the Commonwealth definition for Aboriginal people are the so-called tripart definition, which says you must be of Aboriginal descent, you must be recognised as an Aborigine by some community, some recognised Aboriginal community, and the third thing is you must yourself identify as such. Well, the first two are easy to establish, the last one can be brutally difficult, because race wasn't in fact stated, particularly in later years on birth certificates, and you often have to depend on identifying a source. Mixed race people, for instance, reserves. So that if your family have in fact birth certificates and they relate to a reserve such as Cherbourg in Queensland or Purfleet in New South Wales and so forth, and the name you have is not the name of a local European manager or missionary of the time, then that's the piece of paper you have that looks as though you're of Aboriginal descent. Now, there are a certain number of other things that describe the descent itself. One is the so-called dog tag. Now, these, of course, were only for Aboriginal people who were excused from being Aborigines. And you could apply for this exemption, and it was an exemption to the Act. The Act which forbade Aboriginal people to, for instance, enter hotels and to fraternise with Europeans. And in fact, this tag was carried by many people, usually people of extreme ends of mixed race descent. Now, there's a big problem with mixed race descent. You can't pick an Aboriginal by appearance because, unfortunately, first of all, the colour. Aboriginal people throughout the continent were fairly dark as compared to, say, Melanesians and so forth. And this was a peculiar, according to the late Professor Walsh, genetic trick, in as much as animals that evolved in the tropics they usually have black skin or dark coloured skin. They have a high level of genetically connected melanin in their skin. Now, of course, if there is a reason for not having it, and it's a healthy condition to have a dark skin, if you have a reason for not having the melanin in the skin, then selective breeding assumably takes place and you produce Europeans with very fair skin and fair other colourings such as hair and so forth. One could imagine, perhaps 250,000 years ago, some dark-skinned, fuzzy-haired character running around in the snows of Europe would be something of a sitter for any kind of a predator, and therefore his fairer relations would stand a better chance of survival. And Europeans represent the most highly adapted form of the human species, with straight, flat noses and so forth, and that was also, there's a good reason for that too, if you lived in very cold climates and so forth, and the tendency to lose hair early in life and so on and so forth. Whereas in places like Africa, Melanesia, Micronesia, Indonesia and so forth, there is a good reason to maintain a good genetic connection between the melanin in your skin, and that's of course to protect yourself from hard sunlight. But in Australia, there was never really a reason to maintain, particularly in states like Victoria and Tasmania, to maintain a dark skin. But there was no real reason to lose it either. Human beings, being the fiercest predator that ever walked across this land, feared virtually nothing here. And therefore, Walsh's view is that over the years, the genetic connection with the melanin became somewhat weak. The result is that a first cross with a very dark-skinned, fully descended Aborigine can produce almost white-skinned children, or in fact white-skinned children. Quite often it's sex-linked, and you'll have a family, one of which I know, from a Hungarian father and a virtually fully descendant Aboriginal mother, have two daughters who are peculiarly almost as dark as her, but a son who is absolutely fair. Now, so, you can't judge by coloration. Whereas if you marry a Melanesian person, you will find you will be having brown-skinned children for quite a long time. But so that's the first thing. Features also seem peculiarly to disappear very fast. And so that you can't use description unless you can get them from the past. Now, another good record for tracing family history, of course, is the mission records. Unfortunately, mission records were not terribly well kept, but they often included diaries, particularly of reserve and mission managers. And the diaries described people and events of the time and named people. And this is often as good a connection as is possible. But now the question is, most Aboriginal people know their genealogy thoroughly, because Aboriginal society was a society where no one was allowed to be born, if you like, on the outside looking in. You were born completely part of an entire family. You knew all of your relations, In fact, the world was considered to be your relation. And you learned very quickly your relationship to the rest of the world. Now, this was maintained even through the traumas of the collapse of that social order of old Australia, so that most people who talk about themselves as being Aboriginal have very precise, well-known connections and a genealogy that is understood in their head. Not only that, you'll find when Aboriginal people meet each other, usually the first thing they'll do is they'll ask each other, who are you related to, and identify each other that way. The words that Aboriginal people use to describe themselves, such as Kuri, Murray, Nunga, they're thought. Many people think they just mean people. They don't. They in fact mean what I am to you. They describe a skin system. They describe the relationship to certain social relationships that you bear to other people. And hence, if a Walbury man walks up and meets somebody from, say, an Aranda person, and he says, what are you? You won't say, oh, I'm Walbury, because you can tell that from your face and your voice. You're more likely to say, I'm Jagamara or Sunset or Nimara, and that's give him a skin name, and then he knows whether or not he should introduce you to his sister or so on and so forth. So these words are important. Now, if one of the ways, for instance, but as I was about to say, within the diaspora, there are many Aboriginal people who do not know of their actual descent group. Now you might say, well, if they have such good genealogies, why don't they know that? The reason they don't know that is because of the Australian policy of dispersal and the placing of people on reserves. There were people from all sorts of groups brought onto reserves, and quite often from considerable distance. This is very true of Queensland. And the greatest rate of new identifiers, this is the sort of people I described right at the beginning of this, are in Queensland. In fact, it's estimated that the Queensland Aboriginal population is about twice the present census size. And I'll go into that a little bit later, because there are people that deliberately hide this descent for all sorts of reasons. Now, I can say this, I don't think I know of anyone who would pretend to be an Aborigine for some other reason, because, well, whatever. It has many great advantages, in my view, but it also places you in a situation at the moment of political conflict over certain major disputes, like who owns this place with the rest of the society. And so, but you do find quite a lot of others who will try and avoid that situation. Now, one of the things that helps you trace descent is language, words. Within your family, you will often hear words used. And can I say this? It's not bad to record them, especially from older people. If you have a word you use, like you hear Grandma refer to a toe as a mundowie, or you hear old Granddad speak of a durry when he talks about a cigarette. They're worth recording, because if you happen to be of Aboriginal descent, those things can often lead you to your actual descent group. The words tend to be maintained and passed on through generations. I think because women, who are the bearers of culture and the teachers of language, are taught these as young children, remember them and pass them on to children. So the use of words is very important, the use of Australian words, and quite often you're not aware of them. For instance, the word Kylie, the name Kylie, is an Aboriginal name. There's a number of Aboriginal words that you will find creeping into the names of children these days. For instance, my own daughter was named Heidi, H-A-I-D-I. Now, people assume that that's some variation of the Swedish name Heidi. It's not. It's a Waka word of my own descent, which means quiet place or shady place. Quiet place. So that somebody else picks up the name, likes it, and starts to name a child Heidi. Well, if they do that, of course, that'll lead you nowhere. Just back to perhaps my own family. But quite often, if there's a family name which you have assumed is some odd name from some other descent, it may well point to an interesting descent. Or it may point to a group of people to whom you are related as affines, that's through marriage, and who may be of Aboriginal descent. So that's one important place. The next place is geography. Geography can, unless it happens to be a reserve situation, can be of absolute importance in identifying groups, particularly large groups. For instance, if a person has known their family to have come for many years from, say, Walgett, New South Wales, and they find they are of Aboriginal descent, you can bet straight away they're Kamilaroi. Because that big group dominated there and they virtually didn't let anyone else in. But on the other hand, if you come from, say, down near Wallaga Lake somewhere, well, you could be Huon, but you could be all sorts of things. And it's very difficult to trace the group unless you really have a good geographical fix. Now you might say, how do Aborigines go about searching this part of your family if you suspect that you have some part like this? Well, can I suggest one good place is the institution that I'm responsible to run, the Institute of Aboriginal Studies. We have a most extraordinary library. It is unique in the world and contains the greatest amount of information on any single race of people of any institution that exists in the world. And we have a large print section. We have non-print sections which include language tapes and music tapes and so on and so forth, plus photographs. Now, photographs can often, as you know, with genealogy itself, be critically important in identifying links to the past. The Institute also has several other advantages. Like any library, it has a subject and author index, but it also has a geographical entry. You can use a large map, which is a gridded map. You can pick out a spot on the map and get into the catalogue through that. It also has a language entry. Well, if you happen to know a language, you can use the language to get into the catalogue as well, or you can get from the catalogue out to the language. And the other one, of course, is what we call a tribal catalogue, which gives you actual traditional groups. So if you are searching for a traditional group which you suspect a relationship with, you can go in through that way into the index. Now, Aboriginal people are vitally interested in family histories, even though, as I say, in general they know a great deal about it. But quite often the missing link for Aboriginal people is that final connection to the traditional group. And they know they are Aboriginal descent and they may think they're probably Bundjalung. But they may in fact be a subgroup of Bundjalung known as Gidabel. And getting that right is the thing. Now, we find that in community research, and we fund a fair bit of that, the Institute funds approximately $1 million worth of research generally a year. But it covers all sorts of things. It ranges from medicine to demography to psychology, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, and so forth. But we fund a considerable amount of money. It varies from year to year, but it can be up to several $100,000 in history areas. Now, almost 60% of that is now being consumed in what we call community research. And this is Aboriginal people who wish to search out what boils down to genealogical research. And as a result of that, the library is building up a tremendous network. Now, we've taken a step further, and the Institute also runs the Social Impact of Uranium project. And this project is examining the effect of uranium mining in the Alligator Rivers province in Northern Territory. What we've done there is done an anthropological census. Now, unlike an ordinary census that asks you what you are, this one asks you who you are. Who are your relations? Who did you marry? All those sorts of things. And we have devised a special kind of database, which may interest you people, known as a relational database. We feed all the information in, and then you can use... Why we set about doing it was mainly for health reasons. So that if we pick up a particular health problem within some group within the Alligator River region, we can trace back to see if there's some genetic relationship with it and so forth. But what it allows us to do is bring up a name, and the computer searches through its files in such a way, relating everyone that's been put in there, and it can write you out a complete genealogy, a family tree. Now, of course, it requires one thing, that everyone is related. And it ignores affines. It defines them, but it ignores them in the actual relational thing, so it gives you bloodlines all the time. Let me tell you one of the very great difficulties, though, in searching. So far, that's a good thing. Now, the bad things are this. You see, Aboriginal society existed a long time before men ruled the world. And as a result of that, Aboriginal descent was not defined on paternal lines. But it wasn't defined on maternal lines either. So that the existence of a surname was just not a fact. And in fact, it was the most complex system which involved both paternal and maternal lines. And what you got eventually was you were a kind of person, which was defined by the term I used before, skin, which is a name that describes you as a kind of person, and that kind of person has the maternal and paternal intersections. Now, personal names, in fact, were used more as more for ceremonial occasions, and were rather religiously related to. So if you try and track back traditional names, you will find that where they lead you to is religious services, rather than lead you to family ties. Now, of course, Aborigines realise the great sense of land rights legislation, or the great problems of this. And Aboriginal people are starting to use their names like Europeans, so that it's understandable to Europeans. So that somebody like Galarrwuy Yunupingu gives forth his name like that, and so it sounds like you would call him Mr. Yunupingu. Well, Yunupingu was not actually his surname. Yunupingu describes a clan of people, or a family of people, but it doesn't define them in single patrilineal descent. However, it serves, and it's coming to be used in this way. Also, there is broader intermarriage among Aboriginal people. For instance, the very man I'm talking about has acquired a bride who is of Aranda descent, which is the best part of 1,000 miles from where he comes from. Now, this, of course, is creating complicated systems. So not only is there a broad mixing with other races, there's a more broad mixing between groups. And so the old past is becoming more and more distant and more confused and more history. However, to Aboriginal people, there are some terribly important things about knowing that particular piece of descent. And this is what it is. First, it identifies you as an Australian like no one else can ever be. Because unfortunately, because of the existence of magnetic tape and printing, videotape, and all the other methods of recording, people in polygeneric societies whose race memories came from anywhere else are sort of condemned to be eternal migrants, because in fact no one will let you forget anymore. So if you live here for 20 generations, you will still be able to find out where you come from. Only the Aborigines are permitted to forget. Or it becomes terribly important, because nothing identifies you to this continent like it. Secondly, this is a new land and a new society. And therefore, there is a tendency for all of us who live here to like to see it have some special identity. And I can remember a time when I first travelled overseas where I could walk into an Australian embassy and I couldn't be any different to any other European embassy. Now you can. You walk in and there's a blazing Papanyo Yurikala painting on the wall. There's something that gives it this special identity. And I think the mix of this and the gradual inclusion of this heritage in with the new heritages is what will eventually give us the material culture, at least, of our new identity, whatever that's likely to be. So that, and again, Aboriginal people like to feel important and have status as a result of that. Now, you can only ever really do that. Not only that, it's a lovely thing to be able to name a child on a land that identifies the child with Australia. But Aboriginal people certainly don't, in general, go to deep holes and change surnames. They do, from time to time, use deep holes to change Christian names or first names. These happen to be the names that they usually rename themselves, and certainly are now starting to name children accordingly to the descent group. And the other side of it is, of course, the European heritage. Now, Aboriginal people more or less assume they're Irish. And as far as New South Wales, Victoria is concerned, I think it's largely true. But it's not true in the other states. Western Australia, particularly Queensland, where you get a lot of French and Spanish descent from the Europeans. And the Northern Territory has a huge range of Aboriginal descent. So that, and Aboriginal people are only just now starting to become interested in their European descent. The first frantic search that occurred really through the 60s, 70s was to locate that descent group. Now, most of those thinking people did that and have done that, and now they are starting to explore the European side. And the European side for Aborigines is often extraordinarily difficult. And that brings me to the last part, because many Europeans went to great lengths to make sure that no one knew they're of Aboriginal descent, and for very good reasons. There was great cost in it in the past. And therefore, Aborigines will often run up to extraordinary things, like absolutely missing birth certificates from registry. And of course, if you had no birth certificate, and that was one great trick, then people would, in fact, declare a birth certificate or a document that gave you a place of birth, which was often, in fact, just a straight down the line lie, simply to confuse this descent line. And so, on one side, we have people like yourselves who are weaving their way down through that morass of the past in Australia's unfortunate beginning, and gradually getting that straight. On the other side, you've had the original inhabitants of this place, mixed race people mostly. Traditional people don't have this problem in general, who have wended their way through a quiet system of their own, locating the descent group, and now are moving towards the same areas that you are. And I think the eventual meeting of those two is going to be very interesting in this place. Thank you very much, guys.
Eric, are you available for questions? Any questions, please? John David. Yes, John, let's back first. John.
All people worldwide have Australian Aborigines, they were all married and breed to one another. They come to the cat family and find the tiger, lion, gizzard, except for the lot of scientific know-how will not breed. So when they do breed, they will be sterile. In my mind, the sacredness seems to be Aboriginal 40,000 years on one continent, but I still feel that if we go beyond that bound, you're going to come back to one original people.
Can I just add something to that? Can I add something to that? Certainly, there's well-established archaeological evidence. I'm sorry. There is well-established archaeological evidence for the dates that you've talked about. We have some very interesting evidence coming up the line that dates a long way back. Now, two of the interesting situations, which clearly makes the continent somewhat different to, say, Europe, where you had a fairly modern group of people known as Cro-Magnons associated at one time with a much more archaic group known as Neanderthal. And Neanderthal disappeared from the scene, leaving the present Europeans essentially Cro-Magnons, or direct descendants of Cro-Magnons. Now, in Australia, had a similar situation. You had a group of people who lived in Cow, we've found their remains mainly in the Cow Swamp area of Victoria. And we had a very, very modern people not only modern, but very gracile people, who, well, to give them comparatively, a Cro-Magnon 40,000 years ago would be pretty much like a front row St George footballer compared to Mungo lady, who would have looked very much like a very gracile Japanese lady. Now, the odd puzzle is, though, that the cow swamp people apparently coexisted right up to only 8,000 years ago in the southern part of the continent. It was thought at one time that they may be Homo erectus. Now, that's the link you're talking about, Homo erectus. So far, we have not identified the skeletal remains of Homo erectus on this continent, and yet right next door in Java we have. And the same sort of person, I'm sure it was, or sort of human being, or pre-human being, was the one that carried this species around the world, certainly to Europe. This latest opalized skull of ours, we strongly suspect this time is Homo erectus. And that would confirm your theory. Certainly, Aboriginal people did not begin, the human race of Aboriginal people did not begin in Australia. Aborigines were the first not only placental animals, well, they were certainly the first primates, if not the first placental mammal to be on Australia. And obviously, the home of the primate is Africa, and the home of us who are primates, obviously, if you believe in evolution, has to be Africa. So I agree entirely. Let me say a point that Aboriginal scholars make, because intact in this continent is an extraordinary mythology of creation and so forth. And that creation has no stories of migration, no race memory. And that can simply be explained, it was too long ago. Therefore, religiously, it is possible to say about Aboriginal people that they became human in Australia. And they did, if Homo erectus did live here. And so I think you will find that over the next decade, we will establish the occupation of Australia about 120,000 years, and probably Homo erectus did visit these shores. Gentleman right up there.
Thanks, Mr. Willmot. Last year, a number of us went over to New Zealand to attend the International Congress over there. One of the very interesting speakers was a Maori who talked about their tracing genealogy. His name was Wapapapa, something like that was the tradition they used. And they apparently were very much the same as the Aboriginals, but everybody was very interested in tracing back their genealogy, and from an oral history point of view, you all remember, particularly by the older people, and they passed it down to the younger ones. They stated, and I think it's been shown, that in many cases they could go back 800 or 1,000 years. And I was wondering whether your people could go back as far as that and take the things from there. By comparing genealogies of a number of different groups, they could cross-correlate. In fact, they could go back to the migration from Rarotonga and correlate with records held by the people still living in Rarotonga. I wonder whether the Aboriginal oral genealogy can compare the same.
Well, if you ask a person living in a traditionally oriented Aboriginal group, he'll tell you can trace his genealogy back to the beginning of time, right back to this apical ancestor, as it's called, when we're dealing with clans. In general, you will find Polynesian people are very accurate, tracing back extraordinarily, at least 400 years without any problem. This is true of Hawaii and many, and Tahiti and so forth. And that is also curiously typical of migrant peoples, or people whose lives, nothing is forever, where in fact their settlement of the Pacific is a kind of an adventure of travel and so forth. All the mythologies associated with that. Therefore, I think people who are conscious of travelling become very careful about precise genealogies. Now, people who live on continents, and let me say I was talking to a bunch of Polynesian students, and having in the University of Hawaii earlier this year, and having been to a conference with them and talked to them quite a bit, they have a little term there, I don't know if anyone knows, shakabra, which they describe as handle is, but it really means nothing is forever. And I had to say, well, you're very different to me. I come from a place where everything is forever. Every stone, the wind, every colour, every sunset, it was always like that. And nothing changes. And therefore, continental people tend to trace their genealogy back to a group rather than specific people. And you'll often find that the group predominates. So that if you ask, for instance, modern traditional people, they'll go back usually about 300 years. And from there, I mean, if you would have asked them this 50 years ago, they would have gone back 3 generations perhaps to the source. And then they would not see any point in going past that source statement because those people always were there. Now you'll find that they've developed that beyond that. Part of it, I might add, is due to the land rights legislation, where Aborigines became very concerned that you are able to trace descent back. And of course, tracing descent through oral traditions is very complicated. Has any of you any experience of how this is done? How you do record things through oral traditions? You create songs, is one way, song cycles. Now, the Maoris do this very much, the song cycles that relate to genealogy. So do Aboriginal people. But Aboriginal people also relied very much on a pre-literacy kind of thing, or an early literacy, which was paintings of various sorts, which was mainly on rocks, and then about 50 years ago they started to paint on bark, the same sorts of things. Now these paintings are terribly symbolic, and you go and talk to somebody about it, and they're either creation mythology, that's Dreamtime mythology, or else they are genealogical paintings, which describe clans. And one other thing that confuses the situation when you're getting back to Aboriginal people, they had a very fundamental kind of dualism, philosophical dualism. Now, for instance, Europeans have this dualism that's given in Ecclesiastes, you know, to all things are seasons, time to be born, a time to die, a time to be happy, a time to be sad. And that makes sense if you've ever seen Europe. I mean, one time when you arrive there in the middle of winter, it's terrible, and the next time it's just slightly less terrible. But Australia was mostly a kind of an unchanging place in many ways. So the duality of Aboriginal Australia are that all things are one of two sources, Dua or Yurja. And so that human beings, animals, land, clouds, fish, everything is divided. Now, quite often, the genealogical trait, and not quite often, but always, marriage flips from one moiety to another. You must always marry the opposite moiety. And of course, each moiety has huge traditions. So to actually trace back more than 2 or 3 generations, it is a tremendous problem, but it can be done, but you must do it through song cycles, through paintings and so forth, and then try and knit them together. But because they don't follow a singular paternal line, genealogy in that sense doesn't make any sense.
In the last 2 years, you probably realise that the vaccines that were made were releasing their index to the public. I don't know if you're any good at that look at it, but from my experience in looking at research, it's quite evident that there are a number of entities in the index identified as Aboriginal.
Yes, yes.
And I thought I did that because I imagine that would be a nice little project to go through and analyse that sort of thing.
The unfortunate part is, as I said, quite often birth certificates don't contain this. The trouble is they're not consistent. And so you will often find Aboriginal identified in terms of the index, and then you'll find another group not, that's well-established Aboriginal group. And that gives you a terrible problem, so you can't use it as a definition. It's a guide, but unfortunately you can't use it as a definition.
And also, maybe like a comment on sort of history, as it changed in the name pattern now we're picking up the anti-Saxon, you might say, European style of naming for reasons, legal reasons. But this is back in Wales, so you use this name, and eventually they have to go for the surname as well.
Let me tell you what I expect would happen. If you took a bunch of traditional Aboriginal people, you set them on a ship and send them off migrating to somewhere. You watch it and go along in 100 years' time. They would have developed a name system you could trace. I think it is the beginnings of movement, the beginnings of actually moving out of the place you are to somewhere else where you start to organise the links in a traceable way. If you never move, if this is really your place, then as true of Wales and other parts of Europe where the phenomena of surnames is, in real terms, fairly recent phenomenon. God knows. I have the vaguest idea. I think there was a...
Okay. Now, at this stage, we've also had another very, very fine donation of microfiche to our library from Richard Reed, who I'll ask to explain a couple of things for us and to speak to aspects of the microfiche that he's given. You remember last year, Richard gave us an address about Irish immigration and told us about the microfiche of Irish immigrants, 1848 to 1870, and we'd like to acknowledge this very generous gift that Richard has provided for us. It's quite unique. I'd ask you to convey your thanks to Richard in the approach. I'd ask Richard, would you just explain some aspects of its usage, because it's a unique setup.
That's right. I don't use that thing because I can't stand hearing myself amplified at all. For any of you who use this, I just wanted to put in a couple of words of caution to tell you exactly the problems involved in it. First of all, it's only a first draft towards a book that will be published around 1988, in which all these people will be analysed by a computer whose programming I don't understand at all. What horrifies me actually just when I'm thinking of that is that there are 5 fiche, and that represents 3.5 years part-time work and 45,000 Irish immigrants. And pages that stand about that high in actual computer pages when I get the whole thing printed out and all the sheets I have to actually write out, and you get these 5 little features at the end of it. It's the most sobering activity to use a computer, believe me. Anyway, what are all these fiches? There's 2 sets. There's a set of 5 fiches which contain a person's name, their age, their parish of origin in Ireland, and their county of origin in Ireland, and the parents' names as well, and where those parents are living in Ireland when the immigrants arrive. Now, don't all shoot down there and think that instantly you're going to get all that information every single time. There are lots of gaps. Let's say gaps, let me just give an example. Between 1860 and 1862, for some reason, the Immigration Department in Sydney did not take down parents' names except for one ship, which is survived. So there are no parents during that particular period. During 1860, there are no parishes of origin given either. Again, for a reason I can't explain. There are gaps in the records like that, and the gaps are reflected, of course, in the microfiche. There is also a great problem with Irish place names. Now, you won't see, or you might see beside some place names put question marks. That simply means that despite all my best efforts to go through various indexes and censuses and all the rest of it, I could not tie that particular place down. I wasn't absolutely sure in my mind exactly where it was. So I put a question mark beside it. And there's some very, very bizarre names, as you'll see if you start using these. Also, please don't expect 100% accuracy. When I say 100% accuracy, I'll qualify that. I think it's about 95% accurate, which is not bad. I've gone back and looked at a printout of all the place names by county and seen that I've got them to the range where they ought to be, so I think I've been fairly good in that way. But I have come across a couple of people where it should be county number 7, which is Donegal, it became county 27 and then county Tipperary, and things like that. So bear with me on that. That should all be cleaned up for 1988. If I've got the tenacity of purpose to do it. But there are those kind of errors in it. There will also be errors of spelling with a person's surname. Surnames cause a great deal of problem. When I started this project, I wasn't aware of the phonetic spelling directory that's been put out in the United States to try and clarify all these things, so I didn't even attempt to spell them phonetically. I just put down exactly what the clerk in Sydney put down. And there are probably among some of these surnames 2 or 3 or even 4 variants of the name. Just be aware when you're doing that, particularly with the Max this's and Max that's, that you check all the various possibilities of spelling. Anything else? Yes, there's also a basic index on 2fish, which will locate for you the person, the ship of arrival, and the county of arrival, and their age. And you can work from that fish through to the other ones to give you all the extra details. The first lot are alphabetically arranged, A to Z. Any Irish surnames begin with Z? A to Z, and then it refers you to a ship, and the next 5 fish, that's where the ships are listed in chronological order, from 1848 to 1870. There are of them at the moment 43,960 names. We are about 500 short. Those will be added shortly down in Willmot, so that's punching them on for me, and I'll give the society a printout of that when it arrives. Be aware also that you should always, after you've used these fish, check with Sydney. If you get a name out of it, you get a ship of arrival, and parents' names, anything else, don't take my word for it, because I was doing them in the evening from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock. Right down to the archives in Sydney, so you go with information and just check it, right, just to make absolutely sure. If you're down there yourself, check it. If you find a mistake, please tell me, could you? Or just leave a note in the library. I'm very interested to hear if anybody comes across a mistake on that. Got one or two at the moment, again, particularly with their surnames and things like that. I'll be grateful for one other thing as well, if you use it. I will give here eventually a form, which I would like people who use it to fill out for me. It won't take you very long. If you find an ancestor on it, if you could just give me the progress of that ancestor through New South Wales or whatever happened to them. As they're all arrivals in Sydney, what I'm able to find out what happened to that original arrival. What did they end up with? Where did they die? If they married, they weren't married when they arrived. If they had a will, you prepared to tell me how much they left. Or if so, might have me, not to tell me. One way or the other, I'd be grateful for a few small details, because ultimately I want to try and make this into a project which looks at the fate of Irish immigrants in New South Wales. That's the book I had around 1990. But at the moment it's 1988. I really would appreciate any help that you can give me on locating mistakes in the fish. Another bar I put on the fish, by the way, at this stage, for very obvious reasons, no copying, please. I think I didn't mention that to you. No copying. That's obviously to safeguard my own future as an author. But I don't want anybody coming in and sort of stripping out all the immigrants from County Tipperary and running off and writing an amazing treatise on it at this particular stage. So I've only put these fish in certain areas where I believe that people will not misuse them. I'll be very grateful if you don't do that. Can I do something?
I know that the report, I think at the last meeting, mentioned the fact that reciprocal rights were in the process. I can now publicly announce that this society has reciprocal rights with the Genealogical Society of Tasmania, the Genealogical Society of the Northern Territory, West Australian Genealogical Society, Queensland Family History Society, Genealogical Society of Queensland, South Australian Heraldry and Genealogy Society Incorporated, Genealogical Society of Victoria, and the Australian Institute of Genealogical Studies in Melbourne, which is very good, because so that if you're going to state and you're going to the Northern Territory, you just take your present membership card and bowl in and use their library. We've received another microfiche record. We have the 18 microfiche of the index of the birth, deaths and marriages of Western Australia, pre-1900. Pre-1896, actually. So for the 3 years there, you've got to make up your own mind about the rest of them.